Snow whipped through the streets of Boise, slicing the air like glass. Edward Collins hurried past St. Francis Chapel, his mind on business, until a flicker of movement stopped him. A little girl, maybe 6, stumbled through the storm, clutching a torn cloth bag, her coat ripped, her breath trembling. She fell face first into the snow. For a second, Edward froze, then he was running, his heart hammering, scooping her into his arms as church bells roared above. He didn't know her name, but in that instant, his life split in two before her and after. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. The night fell quietly over Boise, wrapping the small city in a curtain of white. Snowflakes drifted under the streetlights like slow, tired stars. The air was bitter, 10 below zero, and the world felt emptied of sound except for the wind whispering down Capitol Boulevard. Near St. Francis Chapel, a little girl walked alone. Her boots were too thin for the cold. Her coat hung loose and torn at one sleeve. She was 6 no more, and her name was Sophie Miller. She carried a cloth bag pressed to her chest as if it were treasure. Inside lay a singed family photograph and a cracked wooden cross her mother once kept on the wall of their trailer. For 3 days, she had wandered through town, sleeping inside a bus shelter, eating what she found behind a convenience store. People had passed her by, some looked away, some muttered, "Poor kid," without stopping. She remembered her mother's voice, "When you're hurting, help someone, and you won't feel alone." But who could she help now when her hands were too cold to close? She saw the light from the chapel window and tried to hurry. Her mother used to sing there every Christmas Eve. Sophie believed that if she reached the church and sang again, maybe God would remember her too. But her legs shook, her breath turned shallow. She managed to whisper a single line of the carol angels we have heard on high before her knees gave way. Across the street, a man locked his car and pulled his coat tighter. Edward Collins, 40 years old, had planned to meet the parish priest about selling an old plot of land. A retired architect, he had money but no warmth left in his life. His son had died years ago from an overdose. His marriage ended soon after. Since then, he had lived beside the Boise River, seeing people mostly through glass, his windows, his mirrors, his memories. When he noticed the small figure collapse by the gate, he hesitated. The wind bit his face, the street was empty. He almost convinced himself to walk away. Someone else will come, but the child moved a weak twitch under the snow. "Hey," he called, running over. The girl's lips were blue eyes, half open. He knelt, unsure how to touch something so fragile. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" Her head turned slightly. "Mom?" "No, but I'll get help. Hold on." He took off his scarf and wrapped it around her face, then pulled out his phone. The 911 operator asked questions, age, condition, location, but Edward barely heard them. He could feel her small heartbeat, faint and slow against his wrist. Inside the chapel, the door creaked open. A caretaker peeked out, startled by the sight. Edward shouted, "Blanket." "Please." They carried the girl inside, laying her on a pew near the candles. The faint glow touched her cheeks, pale as wax. "She's breathing," the caretaker said, trembling. Edward crouched beside her. He noticed the tiny cross dangling from her fingers. It reminded him of the one his son had made in Sunday school years before. For the first time in so long, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for someone else. Sirens broke the silence, echoing off the snowy streets. Paramedics rushed in, their voices, brisk and professional. They lifted Sophie onto a stretcher, wrapping her in silver foil and wool blankets. One of them asked, "Are you family?" Sir Edward hesitated. "No, I just found her." "You saved her life," the medic said, not looking up. Then they were gone, red lights vanishing into the white storm. Edward stepped outside. The cold struck him hard, and the world seemed too quiet again. Snow had covered the footprints where the child had fallen. Above him, the church bell tolled, slow, solemn, echoing across the river. He stood there for a long moment, hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the dark road ahead. He could drive home, pour a drink, forget what he'd seen. That's what he usually did. But the echo of her small voice, "Mom, can I sing now?" stayed with him, trembling somewhere deep inside. As the last chime faded, Edward looked up at the cross on the chapel roof. Snow caught on its arms, glittering under the streetlight like frost on a window pane. Something inside him shifted almost imperceptibly, a thin crack in the ice that had sealed his heart. When he finally walked back to his car, he left slow footprints behind him, each one filling with snow as he passed. He didn't know it yet, but a door had opened, one he'd kept closed for far too long. When Sophie opened her eyes, everything around her was white walls, sheets, the ceiling that hummed faintly with fluorescent light. For a second, she thought she was in heaven. Then a monitor beeped beside her, and she turned her head toward the sound. A nurse in blue scrubs smiled down. "Hey there, sweetheart. Welcome back." Sophie blinked, her lips cracked and dry. Where's my mom?" The nurse hesitated. "You've been through a lot, honey. You just rest, all right." She adjusted the blanket and stepped aside as another figure entered the room. It was the man from the snow. His coat hung damp on his shoulders and his hair was still dusted with frost. He looked unsure of himself, as if he'd wandered into a place he didn't belong. "Hi," Sophie whispered. Edward cleared his throat. "Hey, kid. You scared everyone last night." She smiled weakly. "Did I sing?" He frowned. "Sing? I wanted to sing a song for my mom. I think I forgot the words." The nurse gently touched Sophie's arm. "You're lucky this man found you. Another hour out there and—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Try to get some sleep." When the nurse left, silence filled the room again, broken only by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Edward stood by the window looking out at the white world beyond. He didn't know why he'd come back. He'd told himself he'd just make sure she was alive, that was all. But when the hospital called him the Good Samaritan on the phone, something inside him resisted leaving it at that. Sophie watched him quietly. "Are you going home?" He turned to her. "Soon. You're safe here. The police will find someone to take care of you." She nodded, but her small hands clutched the blanket tighter. "Can I stay till Christmas?" Edward blinked. "What, I just want to sing for my mom one more time." At the church, he rubbed his forehead, exhaling slowly. "That's not up to me, kid. The social workers will decide where you go." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply whispered, "Please, I won't be any trouble." Edward looked away, pretending to check his phone. He'd built towers, designed bridges, calculated angles and stress points, but nothing in his life felt as fragile as that tiny voice asking him to stay. A soft knock interrupted them. A police officer stepped in, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Collins, we'll need a quick statement. The girl's parents—" He lowered his tone. "They didn't make it. There's no immediate family." Edward signed where they told him, his hand trembling slightly. The officer thanked him and left. He looked at the child again. She had fallen asleep, her small chest rising and falling beneath the white blanket. He sat in the visitor's chair and watched her for a long while, the quiet beeping, the smell of antiseptic, the snow piling against the window. It all blended into a strange calm he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his own son, Daniel, lying pale and still in another hospital room long ago. The memory tightened his throat. When Sophie stirred, he said quietly, "They'll take good care of you, kid." She opened her eyes and whispered, "Are you sure?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'm not sure about much." Later that afternoon, as he was about to leave, the social worker, a woman named Karen, approached him. "She's asking for you," she said. "I think she trusts you." Edward hesitated in the hallway. Through the glass, he saw Sophie sitting up, drawing something on a napkin with a hospital pen. When he entered, she held it up shyly. "It's your house," she said, "and that's me singing on the porch." He looked at the crude lines and stick figures. There was a river behind them, a big yellow sun, and what looked like cookies on the table. He laughed, the sound awkward, rusty. "You don't even know what my house looks like." Sophie grinned. "Then you'll have to show me." For the first time in a long while, Edward had no clever answer. That evening, snow kept falling outside St. Luke's. Edward stood by the nurse's desk, filling out temporary custody papers he didn't remember agreeing to sign. The pen felt heavy in his hand. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Karen asked gently. He nodded slowly. "Just until Christmas." By the time he pulled his SUV around to the hospital entrance, the night had thickened with fog. Sophie waited by the door, wrapped in a borrowed coat and holding her small bag. When she saw him, her eyes lit up. "Do you like hot chocolate?" she asked as she climbed into the back seat. "I guess," he said, fastening her seatbelt. "My mom made the best," she murmured. "She said the secret is a pinch of salt." He smiled faintly, glancing at her in the mirror. The heater hummed, melting the frost from the windshield. Outside, Boise was hushed beneath a blanket of snow. Christmas lights glimmered along Main Street, their colors reflecting in puddles of ice. Edward drove in silence, unsure what to say until Sophie's small voice broke through the hum of the engine. "It looks like heaven, doesn't it?" He didn't answer. The words lingered in the air, simple and pure, like the faint glow of the city beyond the river. When they turned onto Riverside Drive, he felt the strange weight of something unfamiliar, the sense that this child, this fragile, persistent child, had somehow stepped across the walls he'd spent years building. He parked in front of his house, the old wooden porch dusted with snow. The river behind it shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Sophie gazed out the window, smiling. "It's beautiful," she said. Edward followed her gaze. For once, he thought maybe it was. The house by the river had been quiet for years. Dust rested on every shelf, and the faint smell of cedar lingered in the walls. When Sophie arrived, that silence began to bend. Her small footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the soft hum of a tune she barely remembered. Edward watched her from the doorway, unsure what to do with this fragile creature who had suddenly filled his space. He had lived alone too long, his life reduced to routines: coffee at 7, the news at 8, silence until night. Now a child's voice was changing the air itself. "Mr. Edward," she called from the living room. "You don't have a Christmas tree?" He frowned. "No, never needed one." She lifted a stick from a basket near the fireplace. "We can make one." He almost laughed. "That's not how it works." "It can," she said confidently, propping it upright in an old vase. "You just have to believe." Edward returned to his coffee, but he found himself watching as she tied scraps of paper and buttons to the stick. The sight of it, crooked, colorful, and so determined, made something in him soften. Later, Sophie asked if they could bake cookies. He hadn't touched his oven in years, but somehow he found himself measuring flour. The smell of sugar filled the house, settling into corners that hadn't known warmth since before Daniel died. When the cookies were done, she arranged them on a plate near the window. "Who are those for?" he asked. "For the angels," she replied. "If you leave them treats, they visit." He raised an eyebrow. "You believe in angels?" She nodded. "Don't you?" He hesitated. "Not anymore." Sophie smiled as if she hadn't heard. "Then maybe they'll come back anyway." That night, she lay on the rug drawing with colored pencils he'd found in a drawer. "This is my mom," she said, holding up a picture of a woman with golden hair. "She's beautiful," Edward said quietly. "She used to sing at the church," Sophie said. "When she sang, people cried. Not because it was high, because it felt like light." Edward stared at the fire. "I haven't been to church in a long time." "Why not?" "Because I stopped believing anyone was listening." Sophie's voice was calm. "Maybe you stopped talking first." He looked at her, startled. She returned to her drawing as if she hadn't said anything unusual. When she began to yawn, he guided her to the guest room. The bed was old but clean, the lamp glowing softly. She knelt on the bed and whispered, "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Dad. Thank you for sending Mr. Edward." He turned away before she saw his eyes. Downstairs, the fire had burned low. Edward poured water into a glass and stared through the window. Snow drifted across the river, covering the frozen surface like dust on glass. For years, he had seen nothing but stillness there, but tonight he thought he heard water moving underneath. The next morning, Sophie woke before him. She padded into the kitchen, dragging her blanket like a cape. Edward was at the counter staring at an empty cereal box. "You don't have milk," she said. "I don't drink milk." "Then how do you grow?" He laughed before he could stop himself. The sound startled them both. She grinned triumphant. "See, you can laugh." He handed her a mug of hot cocoa. She took a sip and sighed. "Almost like Mom's, needs a pinch of salt." "Salt," he repeated. "That's her secret." He smiled faintly. "I'll remember that." They spent the afternoon decorating their makeshift tree. Sophie found a string of lights in a box near the stairs. When they plugged it in, only half lit, but she clapped anyway. "It's enough," she said. Evening settled, bringing a hush that felt peaceful instead of lonely. Sophie sat near the fire, drawing again. After a while, she said quietly, "Maybe your son sent me so you won't eat dinner alone anymore." The room fell silent. Edward's hand froze on the back of his chair. The air between them felt fragile, full of ghosts. He managed to say, "That's a strange thought, kid." She shrugged. "Mom says angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just get cold." He said nothing, he only adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. When she drifted to sleep, he stayed by the fire, watching the glow flicker against her small face. For the first time in years, he didn't want the night to end. He rose quietly and walked to the fireplace. On the mantel stood an old photograph, his son Daniel smiling beside a paper star. Edward took the picture down, brushed away the dust, and placed next to it the drawing Sophie had made, two figures standing beside a house by the river. He whispered, "Merry Christmas, Daniel." Outside, the wind softened. Snow kept falling, but through the window, the reflection of the tiny lights glowed steady and warm. For the first time in a decade, the house by the river was alive again. The afternoon was gray and quiet. Snow drifted past the windows like ash from an unseen fire. Edward sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, folders, and unopened envelopes. The house smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Sophie was in the living room singing to herself while cutting paper stars. He was supposed to organize the documents for child services, proof of income background check, forms, medical records. It was just paperwork, nothing more. Yet his hands felt heavy. He hadn't opened this drawer in years. When he slid it out, a faint scent of dust and old ink rose. Inside were files from the company he had once owned, Collins Design Group. Sketches of buildings, contracts, termination lists. He hadn't meant to keep them, but guilt has a strange way of preserving what we'd rather forget. He leafed through them absently until one sheet caught his eye. Robert Miller, construction crew, laid off 2013. The name struck him like a hammer, Miller. He read it again. The address matched the neighborhood where the trailer fire had been reported. For a long moment, Edward didn't breathe. His heart thudded, his mind trying to deny what he saw. It couldn't be the same man, but the more he searched, the clearer it became. Robert Miller had been one of his employees let go when Edward signed off a cost-cutting list, a decision he hadn't even reviewed properly. Numbers, not names. Outside, Sophie laughed, her voice light as bells. The sound tore through him. He remembered the headlines that year, the economy tightening, investors demanding savings. He had told himself it was just business, but to that man, to his family, it had been everything. Edward gripped the edge of the desk, trembling. He saw flashes of memory, his office window reflecting rain, a secretary saying, "They'll understand, sir." He had nodded, not caring who they were. Now he did. He stared at the page again, the ink smudged where his thumb pressed. Robert Miller, Sophie's father. He stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. The noise startled Sophie. "Mr. Edwards," she called. He tried to steady his voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just dropped something." But he wasn't fine. The room spun with ghosts. He paced, then sank onto the couch, pressing his hands to his face. All the years of silence, of pretending he wasn't responsible for anyone, it came crashing down. A small figure appeared in the doorway. Sophie was holding one of her paper stars. "You look sad," she said. He lowered his hands slowly. "Just tired." She stepped closer. "You should rest. Mom said sadness makes people heavy." He tried to smile, but his voice cracked. "Your mom was a smart woman." Sophie climbed onto the couch beside him. "Did you know my dad built houses? He said one day we'd have one by a river like in the movies." Edward's throat closed. "Yeah," he whispered. "He must have been a good man." She nodded proudly. "He worked hard. Even when the company closed, he still fixed things for neighbors. Mom said he never stopped helping." The words pierced him deeper than any accusation could. He felt tears rising and didn't fight them this time. Sophie's eyes widened. "You're crying?" He laughed weakly. "Guess I forgot how." Without hesitation, she took his hand in both of hers. Her fingers were small, warm. "It's okay," she said simply. "Maybe we can fix it." The sentence hit him like light breaking through clouds. Fix it. Could anything be fixed now? He looked at her face, so trusting, so certain, and in that moment he made a silent promise. He couldn't undo the postern, but he could change what came next. That evening, as the sky turned the color of steel, Edward returned to the desk. He folded the old document carefully and slipped it into a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it as a reminder. Beside it, he placed a sticky note in his neat handwriting: "Do better, every day." Sophie peeked into the room. "Are you still working?" He shook his head. "No, kiddo. I think I'm done with work for tonight." She handed him a new drawing, two stick figures standing next to a big van with a heart on the side. "I'm designing something," she announced. "It's called the Warm Van. It's for people who don't have houses. We can drive around and give them blankets." Edward stared at the picture, stunned by the innocence of it. The van was pink with yellow lights and smiling faces in every window. "You think we could really do that?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded. "Of course. You're an architect. You can build anything." He chuckled through the tears that had not yet dried. "Maybe you're right." She placed a paper star on his desk. "That's for your van, so it doesn't get lost." He looked down at her gift, this fragile, imperfect star, and felt something shift again, gentler this time. Hope quiet but alive. When she left the room, he stood by the window. The river was frozen, the sky turning dark. In the reflection, he saw himself older, smaller, but behind him, the faint light of the trees Sophie had made glowed in the corner. Edward whispered to the empty room, "We'll fix it, Sophie. I promise." The snow fell harder, blanketing the streets, softening everything it touched. Inside, the paper star shimmered faintly under the desk lamp, thin, delicate, but unbroken. Snow kept falling through the night, turning Boise into a quiet sea of white. Edward woke early the next morning, the world outside his window soft and still. On the table beside him lay Sophie's drawing from the night before, two stick figures beside a big van covered in hearts. The warm van. He stared at it for a long time. The simplicity of it, the certainty moved him more than any sermon could. For years he had built skyscrapers meant to last forever, yet none had left warmth behind. This child with paper and crayons had drawn something that could. Downstairs, Sophie was humming to herself, spreading peanut butter on toast. "Morning, Mr. Edward," she said brightly. "I made breakfast, sort of." He smiled. "Looks perfect." On the kitchen counter sat a small jar of coins she'd collected from his junk drawers. "That's our van money," she announced. "We can start small. Mom always said big things begin with kind things." Edward nodded, touched by her seriousness. "How about we start today?" Her eyes widened. "Really? Really? But first we need a van." By noon, they were standing in the cold parking lot of a used car dealership near Garden City. The salesman wearing a Santa hat grinned when he heard their plan. "A mobile kindness project. You're the first customers today who didn't ask for a truck to haul beer." Edward laughed. "We'll take the old Ford Transit in the corner." The van was dented and faded blue, but Sophie ran her small hand along its side as if greeting a friend. "It's perfect," she whispered. That afternoon, they cleaned it together. Sophie taped her drawings to the walls, stars, hearts, and a crooked angel with giant mittens. Edward installed a small heater and filled the back with boxes of blankets, canned soup, and thermoses of hot cocoa. When the sun set, they drove through the snowy streets, the van rumbling like an old hymn. The city was silent except for the hum of their tires on ice. At the first intersection, they saw a man sitting near a bus stop wrapped in a thin coat. Sophie tugged Edward's sleeve. "He looks cold." Edward Park stepped out and handed the man a blanket and a cup of cocoa. The man's hands shook as he accepted them. "You folks angels or something?" he asked. Sophie smiled shyly. "Just helpers." They continued down Main Street, stopping wherever the light of the van revealed someone in need, a woman sitting beside her shopping cart, a young couple holding hands under a bridge, an old veteran leaning against a wall. Each time Sophie offered food, blankets, or a smile, and each time Edward felt something inside him mend stitch by stitch. Near the river, they found a small group gathered around a barrel fire. Sophie climbed down, carefully clutching a box of cookies. She walked straight to a woman whose face was red from the cold. "You can have mine," she said, holding out her scarf. The woman hesitated. "Honey, that's too nice. She needs it more," Sophie said, echoing her mother's words. Edward watched from the van door, the flames flickering across her small face. The sight undid him. All the guilt, all the years of emptiness melted into something pure and heavy gratitude. He whispered almost to himself, "You fixed it, kid." Sophie turned and smiled. "No, we fixed it." They drove until their supplies were gone. The heater clicked softly, the air inside thick with the smell of cocoa and wet wool. Sophie leaned her head against the window, watching snow fall through the beams of their headlights. "Are we going to do this again tomorrow?" she asked sleepily. "Every winter," he said. "Maybe longer." She nodded, her eyes closing. "Then we'll need more stars." He glanced at the paper star taped to the dashboard, the one she'd given him the night before. Its edges fluttered each time the heater blew. He reached out and smoothed it gently. When they passed St. Francis Chapel, its bell rang in the distance. Edward slowed the van. "You still want to sing for your mom?" Sophie sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Can I go ahead?" he said softly. She began to sing, her small voice filling the van. "Angels we have heard on high." Her pitch wavered but stayed true. The melody floated through the open window, mingling with the sound of the bell. Edward felt the cold air touch his face, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe the sound meant something. When the song ended, Sophie whispered, "Do you think she heard me?" He looked at her eyes shining in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Yeah, sweetheart, I think everyone did." They parked by the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, breaking and reforming like pieces of a forgotten prayer. Sophie curled up under a blanket and drifted into sleep, her hand still holding the empty cookie box. Edward sat behind the wheel watching the snow fall on the hood. The reflection of the paper star glowed faintly in the windshield. He thought of Robert and Grace Miller, of his own son, of every choice that had brought him here. Then quietly he whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the storm eased, leaving the world wrapped in silver silence. The warm van rested beside the frozen river, its windows glowing softly, a beacon for anyone who still believed in second chances. A year had passed since that first winter. The city of Boise glowed under a curtain of snow again, soft and endless. Christmas lights blinked along rooftops, reflecting on the frozen river. From a distance came the hum of a small engine and the steady glow of headlights cutting through the night. The warm van moved slowly down Main Street. Its sides, once faded blue, were now painted white with bright red hearts. The words "Hope Rides Here" shimmered faintly under the street lamps. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and cocoa. Edward Collins sat behind the wheel, his beard touched with gray, a knitted scarf wrapped around his neck, the same color as the one Sophie had once given away. Beside him, Sophie, now 7, worked with quiet focus, filling paper bags with cookies, socks, and handwritten notes that said, "You are not forgotten." "Where to first, Mr. Edward?" she asked, glancing up with her bright eyes. He smiled. "Downtown Plaza. The shelters are full tonight." When they arrived, several figures were huddled under a shop awning, shielding themselves from the wind. Sophie jumped down, her boots crunching on the snow. "Merry Christmas," she called, handing each person a cup of hot cocoa. The steam curled around her face like a halo. One man took the cup, staring at her in disbelief. "You folks angels or something," Sophie shook her head. "Just people who care." From across the street, a woman with a camera watched them. Anna Garcia, a local reporter, had been following the warm van project since spring. She approached with a cautious smile. "Mr. Collins, may I ask a few questions for the holiday piece?" Edward nodded. "Of course." She adjusted her microphone. "Why do you do this every year?" He paused, looking at Sophie, who was now laughing with a young boy near the van. Then he faced the camera. "Because once," he said softly, "she knocked on my door in the snow, and I finally opened it." Anna lowered the mic. For a moment, no one spoke. Snow fell thicker, muffling, the city turning it sacred. Sophie tugged at Edward's sleeve. "Can we go to the church now?" He smiled. "Let's." They drove towards St. Francis Chapel, its bell glowing faintly through the storm. When they arrived, the steps were covered in white. Sophie stood there, looking up at the cross. "This is where you found me," she whispered. Edward nodded. "And where you found me too." She smiled, then began to sing the same carol from that night a year ago. Her voice rose through the falling snow, pure and trembling. "Angels we have heard on high." Edward joined her on the second verse, his voice low, uncertain but true. The wind carried their song across the river over the sleeping city. When the last note faded, Sophie turned to him. "Do you think Mom heard us?" He looked at her, eyes bright. "I think everyone did." As they drove away, the van's lights shimmered across the frozen water, a moving star in the dark. For those who saw it, it was only a van. But for one man and one child, it was proof that kindness could still pierce the cold and light. Once lost, could always return. Today's story comes to an end, but its echo still lingers in the heart. What do you think? Give us a score from 1 to 10 and feel free to share a few words in the comments. Every voice here is valued and heard. Before you go, let me ask you gently, are you doing okay today? If your heart feels heavy, let this place be a quiet corner where you can share and find comfort. See you again in the next bedtime story, where love and hope remind us that no matter how dark the night may seem, kindness will always prevail.